You're listening to Out of the Box with Rosie Tran. Out of the Box is sponsored by hugmetees.com. Spread love, give a hug, hugmetees.com. Guys, I am so excited about all of the positive emails lately. However, I just want to remind everyone, if you have a positive comment about the podcast, to go on our iTunes or Stitcher page and leave it there. That helps us out so much more than sending me a direct email. And now, as always, we are on soundcloud.com/outoftheboxpodcast. So you can find us there and click on the follow button. We don't have as many followers on SoundCloud as on Stitcher and iTunes. So we love new followers. And if you really, really like the podcast, you can click on the subscribe button on iTunes, and that also helps us out quite a bit. I am so excited to be here today with a very special guest. She has a new book out called Dollars and Sex, and she is a professor of economics at the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia. Also launching the online knowledge forum Big Think, which was named the #1 news and information website by Time Magazine in 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Marina Adshade. Marina, how are you?
I'm terrific. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. So you have a new book out, Dollars and Sex, which talks about how it looks at relationships and dating through an economics perspective. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm an unusual economist, unlike other economists who talk about things like, interest rates and exchange rates and whether or not the economy is growing. I look at personal relationships and look into how economics can inform us about the decisions we make in those relationships.
But in a way, don't you think that's so much more important? Because a lot of those facts and figures that you were talking about in traditional economics, they're all very theoretical, where this is actually applied to people's everyday lives.
Yeah, and that's actually why I started doing this topic. I used to be that kind of economist. I used to be a macroeconomist, and I used to teach classes on macroeconomics, and I used to sit out and look at my students with their very bored faces.
They're like falling asleep in class.
Explain to them why the exchange rate is adjusting. And I really wanted to find a way to convey my enthusiasm for economics to my students. And so this is exactly why I started doing this. I started teaching a course on the economics of sex and love because I thought it was so important, and I thought that it was a really great way to get students to apply economics to their own lives. And it does apply to our own lives. And you can barely go online and read an article or pick up a newspaper and read an article without seeing examples of how economics is playing out in our personal relationships.
And your class was such a huge success. You offered it, was it the first time, 2009?
Yeah, something like, geez, it's hard to believe it's been that long ago, but yes.
And it was like booked out, everyone wanted in, right?
Yeah, it was really funny because this doesn't happen very often in university courses, but the week before the course started, somebody in the media picked it up, and so it was actually in the Sunday Times in the UK, and a Russian newspaper covered it, and a Japanese newspaper covered it. So by the time the course actually started, people on campus were quite excited, and I had people sitting on the floors, and it was a big room. We had 200 students anyway, but they were sitting down the stairs, all there checking out to see what we were going to be talking about in this crazy new course.
Well, it definitely sounds very, very interesting. Now, you talk about a lot of interesting things in the book. I read a little bit of it. Unfortunately, I didn't get to finish it before our interview, but there's certain things that are linked, like you talk about promiscuity and how women kind of don't have not the benefit, but there's how did you word it? There's no purpose, I guess, since education for women is now higher. To protect their virginity, or protect that from an economics point of view?
Yeah, well, the whole stuff on promiscuity is really interesting, and it's become even more interesting since I finished writing the book, because last year, I can't remember when it was, it would have been in February at some point in time, an organization that's affiliated with the University of Texas put out a video called The Economics of Sex and Love. And it was really interesting because they were taking economic theories and applying them to the topic of promiscuity, but they weren't doing it in a way that I agree with or actually any other economists agree with. What they were arguing there is that the market for casual sex, there are buyers and sellers, But the men are all the buyers and the women are all the sellers. And what they're arguing is that, well, women don't like sex as much as men. I have no idea why they think this. The women have to be compensated to encourage them to engage in this activity that they don't really enjoy. And so when societies became more promiscuous and women made themselves more available to men, the price that women could get for sex decreased. And so things like not being able to get somebody to marry you or that level of commitment. And so they were arguing that what we really need is for women to band together and withhold sex from men, return to the good old days. And that would drive up the price of sex, and before you know it, every woman, we'd all have white picket fences, which is what we really want, other than a healthy sex life. And it was really interesting. In fact, I'm doing this exact topic I teach a big first year class at the moment. I'm doing exactly this video tomorrow in class, so it's been on my mind. And it is an interesting story because they're using this very kind of rudimentary understanding of economics, but without properly applying economics. Because anybody who properly applies economics knows that you can't have millions of women banding together to withhold sex. It's never going to work because there's always going to be somebody who's going to say, oh, I don't care about this female, consortium. It's like the OPEC oil.
The OPEC oil of women.
Getting together and reducing the supply of oil. It's just never going to work. But it's an interesting story, and it's a cool... It's cool that we're seeing these economic principles being applied. In this case, they're not applied properly, but at least it encourages us to have these conversations. So I did talk a bit about promiscuity in the book.
So what is you're saying you disagree with this theory that's with the supply and demand. What is your idea on it? Just for the listeners who haven't read the book or don't know about it.
Well, I would agree actually that. The increase in promiscuity is reducing marriage rates. I think that makes a lot of sense. If you're 19 and there's zero chance of you getting laid if you don't get married, sure, you're going to be anxious to rush into getting married. And so it's going to reduce marriage rates because it will postpone the age at which people get married. I mean, people are happy to get married when they're 30 now because they can have sexual relationships in their 20s. So that's probably true. I mean, I disagree with them that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that people marrying a little later is a good thing because those marriages are generally happier and they last longer. The part I disagree with is the idea that women should band together or can even band together and withhold sex in order to return to some 1950s ideal that just no longer exists, because I just don't think it would possibly work.
To have a female no sex pact, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, of course, in order for the female no sex pact to work, OPEC oil producing countries, we all know they got together in the 1970s. They reduced the supply of oil, and that drove the price of oil up. And the only way they could do that is by having a mechanism for punishing people who deviated, right? So the country that produced more oil than they said they were going to produce, they had a mechanism for punishing them. It's the same thing with the economics of sex story, is that the only way it would work is if you punished women who deviated. And so basically what they're advocating for is slut-shaming on a grand scale. And I don't think anybody wants to think of that as a mechanism for improving, or sees it as a way of improving social norms. I certainly don't, and I can't see any alternative to that. I actually wrote them and said to them, it seems to me that you're advocating for slut-shaming here. And responded, well, that's one possibility, but there are other possibilities. And so I wrote them again and said, what exactly are the other possibilities? To which I got no response.
And we all know that doesn't work because during some of the past OPEC, when they were trying to control the flow and sell of oil, a lot of countries did sell kind of under the table. Sure. When they were told not to, just when they were trying to do supply and demand. So
prices are high. Why would you not sell, right? I mean, that's the thing, is that these consortiums that try to restrict quantity, increase prices, they don't work when there's 2 or 3 or 4 countries or firms. How is it possibly going to work when you have millions of women? It's just not possible, right? The market just doesn't operate like that, and it's just a strange argument, and it's just such a misapplication of the theory. Actually, I don't really, my views on this have evolved since I wrote the book. When I wrote the book, I was more willing to think about supply and demand. But I think I'm moving away from that. And I'm starting to think about the markets for sex as more like barter economies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in a barter economy, you have people trade goods for goods or services for services because they don't have money to trade. Usually that's the way. You know, the markets of sex are very similar to that in that we're not necessarily buyers and sellers or, you know, really what we all are is we're all buyers and we're all sellers. And so that makes for an interesting market because when I want to engage in trade, I have to find somebody who is buying what I have to sell and is selling what I want to buy. And that's one of the reasons why these markets are so difficult. It's one of the reasons why it's so hard to find somebody, you know, to marry, and why the search takes so long is because we all have the set of requirements that we want. And, you know, we have to find somebody who meets those requirements. And then we have that person also has to be looking for what we have to offer. So that makes for a difficult market. But it's also more interesting to think about it that way, right? It's more interesting than thinking that it's like a market for coffee or a market for used cars. It's really nothing like that. Because
it's a lot more complicated.
Well, the car doesn't have to want you back, right?
Yeah.
Coffee does not, you know, need to feel that you're going to fulfill them. None of that is an issue in regular markets, but it is in markets for sex and love. And so I think it's a nice way to think about it as a barter economy.
So what was the most interesting or maybe contradictory thing that you learned in your research when you were applying economics to sex and relationships that you maybe had a misconception about or thought differently, but the numbers show something else?
Oh my gosh, there's so many things, you know, over the year. I wrote the book when I was living in France. I went to France and that's all I did was write this book. And it was such a journey. You know, it was a journey for me because when I set out, I already had a lot of information. I've been writing my blog for years. I've been teaching the course for years. I guess so part of my brain thought that I would just sit down and hammer out this book. But I think that every day that I learned something new about human behavior, about the way that people negotiate their relationships, about the way what makes for a successful relationship, but also just looking at how much things have changed over time. Like, you know, for example, one of the things, we like to make a lot of assumptions about what women are looking for. And what we generally assume is that what women are looking for is that they're looking for somebody who has more education than them, and they're looking for somebody who earns a better income. And because historically that was true. But when you look at the numbers, that's just changing so remarkably quickly, right? I mean, we have so many more educated women now. You know, for example, in the U.S., if you look at women between the ages of 25 and 45, which we think about as prime marrying years, for every 100 men who have a university degree, there's 125 women in that group. And so it can't possibly be true that all the women are marrying educated men. And so you might think, well, maybe these women are kind of lowering their expectations or they're compromising or they're just not getting what they want. And I actually don't think that's true. And the more I look at the data, I don't think that's true. What I think women are doing is looking for other things, right? Women, for example, many educated women are now marrying younger men, right? Men who are actually significantly younger than them, like 5 to 10 years younger than them. And I guess the idea is, you know, I have income. I can support myself and give myself the lifestyle. What I really want is a man who's, you know, energetic and wants to do lots of things with me. And so they're looking for younger men. That's kind of surprising. And the numbers have increased so remarkably in the last 10 years. It's just hard to fathom. I mean, from the data from the UK, it's almost in the double digits now for women who are in their 40s and getting married who have university degrees. Something like 16% of them are marrying men who are significantly younger than themselves. So I find that interesting. I think that it's interesting that how much we're changing our expectations of relationships over a fairly short period of time and largely in response to economic factors.
Now, does that data only apply to the developed world? Is it different in the world and developing world?
Yeah, so it's always interesting to look at the developing world. And you know, when I started off my academic life, I was actually an economic historian. And I've always had interest in history and how things have changed over time. And you see that playing out in the book. Like I talk about the history of promiscuity, talk about the history of marriage, because it interests me how society changes, because I think it helps us and think about how society is going to change in the future. And when we look at the developing world, it's a lot more similar to the way that we were historically, right?
Maybe like 50 years ago or just in general, in the history of...
I'd say more than 50 years ago. I would say something closer to like 100 or 120 years ago. You know, where you have women are largely not employed in the wage workforce, very, very low levels of education that we haven't seen in North America in 100 years. And so, they're behind us in that sense, which helps us to understand what can happen to move things forward, right? For example, I think that there's a lot of consensus that we'd like to see fertility rates fall in many developing countries, because those countries would be a lot better off if they could reduce their fertility rates in terms of standards of living for everybody. Now, when we saw our fertility rates started falling in North America 200 years ago. And 200 years ago, the birth rate here was like 7 women per child. By the time you get to the 1930s, it's down to, actually, for the U.S., the birth rate in the 1930s is exactly the same as what it is now. So we saw that happen, and we know why it happened. And so we can look at the developing world today, and we can say, well, if some of these countries just have impossibly high fertility rates, this is what we need to do. We need to educate women and give women opportunities in the workforce, because that will encourage them to have fewer children. We need to, give women opportunities to control their fertility, of all the things that we've seen happen. So it's interesting to look at the intersection between the history and the developing world, and I find it infinitely fascinating.
Where do you think is the future? We're using this data to predict, like you said, what's going to go on in the developing and third world. Where do you think the future of the developing world, as far as economics and sex, is going?
Well, it's difficult to make predictions. For you to ask people 50 years ago about what was going to happen in some of the poorest countries in the world, I think every economist you would have talked to would have foreseen a much better future than they're experiencing now. Development is an incredibly complicated... In
terms of industrialization, or just in terms of...
In terms of industrialization, and a lot of it, especially in African countries, is, when colonization ended, which wasn't even that long ago, right? We're talking in the 1960s, and even later for some countries, countries were just left behind with very poor structures for government, and it's very difficult to change structures for government quickly. And so that's what really needs to happen in those countries before they can see any real development. And nobody really knows how to do that, but we can make small differences. For example, creating new laws that protect children from marriage. We know that children, when you have child marriage and you have girls married at a really young age, it just doesn't bode well for the economy as a whole, or for people as a whole. Getting rid of polygamy would be very good in many of these countries, or at least try to reduce polygamy, because polygamy it used to be good for children in the past, but now it's those children suffer in those families. Educating women.
Why was it good in the past?
That's a really interesting story, because, of course, historically, if you're in a kind of largely agricultural society, right, and so you're farmers, you're subsistence farmers, children in polygamous families were better off because they had multiple caregivers, and each one of those caregivers could specialize in a job, right? So one mother would be responsible for preparing food. The other mother could be responsible for taking care of children. Maybe a third mother, does vegetable growing.
So it's kind of like a business, right?
So it's a business in which people specialize, right? So they're specializing in their tasks, and when they specialize in their tasks, everybody is a little bit more productive, right? Because you get to divide labor. Economists get very excited about this sort of thing. It's actually a little bit like trade, right? So if you have two countries, one that is good at producing one thing, maybe they have a lot of labor, and you have another country that is very good at producing another thing, maybe they have a lot of capital, then those countries should engage in trade, where each one's specializing in what they're good at. It's true within the household as well. It's true in polygamous households. It's true in any households. It's true in same-sex households. That those households are more productive when people specialize in the tasks at which they're most efficient. And so there was a lot of efficiency traditionally in polygamous families. And so children historically have been better off in polygamous households. But it's less true now, because now so much of children's well-being is tied to income, because income makes it possible to pay for good health care, to pay for good education. And income in polygamous households is generally in short supply, because there's generally so many children and wives that it has to be shared over. And so that's what's making children worse off today.
So it's a supply and demand issue again.
Yeah, well, yeah,
there's a short supply of education.
Well, there's a short supply of funds to pay for education, right? We have a tendency to forget that because we're so lucky, we in North America where we don't have to pay for elementary education, but this is not true in a lot of developing countries where people are still having to pay for elementary education for their children, and so polygamous families are just far less likely to pay for that, and especially for their daughters. And so then it gets into a cycle, right? Better education, there's always far less polygamy. But in order for people to become better educated, there has to be money to pay for it.
So what I'm hearing is better education for women equals better economic situations for countries equals all around good stuff.
It's all good stuff. It all hinges around female education.
It does. And I know Oprah talked about this when she started her school for girls in Africa, because everyone said, well, why did you choose a school for girls? Why didn't you choose, a co-ed school? And she said, well, when you transform women, you transform the community and you transform the world.
Yeah. It's funny. A lot of Americans don't realize this, but, they were the U.S. was the world leader in education, in high school education. So, back when the rest of Europe and stuff didn't start really offering high school education until the 1920s and the 1930s, the U.S. had universal high school education as early as like the 1880s. And since the very beginning, women have been better educated than than men in the U.S. in terms of high school education. And it made a big difference over time. The fact that girls could go to high school, complete high school, and that so many of them did, even really early in the country's history, because it gives women control over their own lives. It gives them options. And when they have options, even when they're, staying at home and taking care of children, when they have options to support themselves, it gives them far more control over their own lives. And when women have more control over their own lives, their children do better. And that's because the sad reality is that when mothers decide how money is spent, they're far more likely to spend it on children than fathers are.
I want to talk about some of the case studies that you use in the book, Jane, in the opening, and other people. Are all of these based on 100% factual, or are these based on maybe a caricature of several women that you've met or other people that you've met that you have done case studies on, or were these actual real live people that you were talking about?
So all of the stories of Jane are about me.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
I did not know that.
Totally out myself on that. Jane has had a very interesting life. I think this is part of the reason why I find this topic so fascinating, is because so many of these things have played out in my own life. So that's me. And then some of the stories are actually about my daughter. And,
okay.
And then the other stories have been pieced together from stories that people tell me. There's something about me. I cannot get on an airplane without the person sitting next to me telling me their life story. People just want to tell me this stuff, even before they know what I do. It's just fascinating how much information people will share, and so some of it is composite from other stories that I've been told.
Okay, so it's all true. It's not like some case studies and you're changing names and making, everything is basically true real life stuff.
It's all true real life stuff, yeah.
Because sometimes people will, they'll base. I mean, obviously, your book is not a work of fiction; it's a nonfiction book. But sometimes people will have stories within or examples, and they'll base it on kind of, maybe the person will be named Jane, and it'll be based on 2 or 3 different women. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Well, one of the when I started writing the book, one of my favorite books of all time is Robin Baker's Sperm Wars. I don't know if you've ever read it.
I haven't.
Oh, gosh, it's such a good book. It's like academic porn. Like you need to have a cold shower after you've been reading it for a while. And the
Sperm Wars, that's what it's called?
So good. It's so Sperm Wars is based on it's all about evolutionary biology, and it's explaining a variety of human behaviors from an evolutionary perspective. But every single chapter starts with a fictional component. And it's quite racy, like remarkably racy. And I would love to have done something like that, but I just, Well, first of all, it's much harder to do. It's easier to do when you're an evolutionary biologist and you're talking about sperm right off the bat. It is for an economist. But I started knowing that I wanted to have this fictional component to it. And I think when I started, I think my idea was to do more like what Robert Baker does and just tell purely fictional stories. But, you know, in some respect, books write themselves. And so as I was writing those stories, they just never were fictional. They all just came from true stories. I might regret having told you that I was Jane, but
don't regret it.
You know, the whole section about why my marriage ended. Sometimes I feel like just printing that off and mailing it to my ex-husband. But yeah.
So the secret is revealed.
You've heard it here for the first time.
For the first time on Out of the Box podcast, Marina Adshade outing herself as the protagonist of her own book. So is there a race component within some of the stuff that you're talking about where, you know, if someone, I know obviously social, economic, and in this country, usually if you're Black or Latino, then you're tied to more poor economic conditions in this country. Did you see that at all in your research?
Yeah, you know, that's one of the more interesting parts about the research. It's interesting because when I started thinking about these ideas, I think the temptation is to stay away from the notion of race because you want to be careful about making generalizations about people's behavior based on race. Of course, that should go without saying. And so you kind of want to avoid it, but it's almost impossible to avoid, and it's not very honest to avoid because different groups of people face different choices and entirely different environments. And so because of that, they have different outcomes. And some of those outcomes are associated with very, very real costs. And to ignore the element of race, I think, does a disservice to those groups of people. So the most obvious one is just the unbelievably low marriage rate of African American women relative to women of all other racial groups. And trying to explain that and think about that within economic framework, I think is really insightful because it explains why there's such a low marriage rate, and then at the same time explains why the out of marriage birth rate is also so high, right? And so it makes for an interesting perspective when you think about it in terms of the economics, and particularly when you think about the markets on which those women are looking for relationships.
So, I know the reason because I had read that part, but do you mind sharing with the listeners?
Sure, and I don't even think there's just only one reason. But I think that the thing is that this racial gap that you get in marriages really is an American story, right? We just don't see it in Canada where I live and in other places. You don't see the big racial gap in marriages. And so one of the kind of most obvious explanations is just the high incarceration rate of young Black men relative to men in other groups, right? The U.S. incarceration rate is 7 times higher than it is in Canada on per capita basis, and ours isn't even particularly low.
Well, we have the highest incarceration rate in general in the entire world, which is insane.
You are number one.
We are. America is number one in prisons.
Yeah. And the thing is that, and it's you're number one, and the prison population is largely made up of young Black men, right? The probability of a young Black man being incarcerated at some point in his lifetime is shockingly high. I don't want to get into the reasons why. Actually, one of my colleagues here, the Vancouver School of Economics, that's all the research she does, is looking at that topic, and it's interesting, and it's a discussion in itself. However, it really influences the marriage markets, right? And it influences the marriage markets because it creates a shortage of men, not just when those men are incarcerated. You know, they're totally off the marriage market in general. Although I do have a friend who married somebody while he was in prison, so it's not totally out of the realm of possibility. She had 4 children with him before she was released.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
I can't believe that.
And then, but it's not just that. It's just that, because incarceration carries a lifelong penalty for people in terms of
because it's hard to get jobs, and they have that on the record. Yeah,
you know, it makes it it reduces the supply because when they're not on the market, but then it reduces the supply of men who have the capability of getting employment that they can use to support a family. And that, in any socioeconomic group, that's going to reduce marriage rates because a lot of women who are already supporting children, find themselves married to a man who's unemployed or underemployed becomes very difficult, and it just creates for stressful marriages. And so for these reasons, there's a shortage of men. And what I find really interesting about this from Economist is that none of this should really matter. And the reason why it shouldn't matter is because, of course, black women are not confined to marrying black men, right? They can marry men of any other group that they want. And then there's other studies that have been done by economists that actually look at the propensity for interracial marriage.
There's a higher percentage of black men marrying outside of their race than black women.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that the main driver of this, and we know this because we do experiments that are speed dating trials and other types of experiments. The way the speed dating trials work is, you probably know what speed dating is. You come to a social engagement. There's bunch of single people. You spend 2 or 3 minutes talking to each one of them, and then at the end of the night you write a list of names of people that you'd like to have your contact information shared with. And so economists have done these trials to try to separate out same race preferences in marriage. Because, if I see a black man that's married to a white woman, it doesn't really tell me anything about same race preferences. And what's really interesting is when they do those trials, the group of people who's most discerning about the race of their partner is black women. They have a much higher same race preference than does any other group of women. Other groups of women have small same race preferences, and then interestingly, Asian women actually have a preference to marry outside of their own race.
I know, I have heard that, and I am married outside of my race, and I just want to know, why is that?
Everybody has preferences,
But as a whole culture, I mean, that's just crazy. It seems to be a trend with certain cultures.
35% of marriages of Chinese women in the U.S. are to non-Asian men. 35%. It's a lot. So that is interesting in and of itself. And that, those type of preferences, I would be lying if I could say that as an economist I have an explanation for that, because I can't explain preference. I can't explain everything. And then getting back to the story about low marriage rates in the U.S. is that, so you've got two things going on. One is the high incarceration rates and the low employability of men who have a criminal record, tied together with this same race preference, and that's really what's driving it. If black women didn't have the same race preference, if they wanted to marry Asian men, they might be a lot more successful, right? But that's really what drives that market. And then it creates interesting, there's some actually good side effects that comes from it, right? Because
from interracial marriage.
Well, interracial marriage. There's lots of good things that come from interracial marriage, but
genetic diversity.
Genetic diversity is always good. But because of the incarceration rate, so specifically, they have encouraged black women to become better educated. This is why we see such high education rates among black women, because women, when they look forward in their lives, they don't necessarily see a future in which they're going to be married to somebody or be married to somebody who has a higher income than themselves. And so they're forced to invest in their own education. They're forced to spend more time in the workforce. And so there are some positive effects from that in terms of the women, and the women are responding in a way that improves, their own standards of living. But it comes at a cost, because there's a lot of benefits to being married. And we have a lot of people who, of course, not everybody has to be married. I'm not married. I'm quite happily not married. But, for people who want to be married and see benefits to that, I think it's really unfortunate to be on a market where you can't find someone.
Yes. And now, does cohabitating affect marriage and the financial? I know a lot of people now are cohabitating and just living together for, endless amounts of time. And a lot of millennials, the statistics are that millennials are getting married less and less or waiting, or seeing that there's less I guess, reason to get married. I'm not sure if that was in your book or if I just read that in an
It's
article.
true. What's interesting about that is that for a long time, people believed that cohabitation was just bad for marriage. This was this overriding message that we were hearing saying, no, you shouldn't live together before you get married because people who live together before they get married are more likely to end up divorced if they do eventually marry because they don't take commitment seriously. Now we're finding, and we're looking at the evidence, this is just not true. I mean, this is all, you have to use proper statistical techniques to separate these things out. I mean, the main thing that messes this whole thing up is that people who are very tied to their church and to Christianity are far less likely to cohabitate, and they are also more likely to stay married if they get married because they have lower divorce rates. And so it makes it look like not cohabitating is tied to lower divorce rates. But that's not really true. Okay, so people you're not doing any harm to your future marriage prospects by living together. And so I think that the next generation, actually, you know what? It's not even the next generation. I'm finding that a lot of older women who are in their 50s and 60s, they're also not marrying. So if you were married and you're divorced, that generation,
not remarrying.
They're not remarrying, or if they've remained single, they're not marrying. A lot of older people are also choosing to live together and avoiding, the costs of getting married and the potential costs of getting divorced, and just keeping their lives a little bit simpler. So we're seeing this on the rise everywhere.
So Dr. Adshade, everyone, is saying that it doesn't hurt you ladies to move in with your guy, and I actually advocate for it because I was in a relationship previously before I was with my husband, and as soon as I moved in with the guy, he totally changed personalities. So I think it's a good thing to test out the water before you're going to be living with someone for 40, 50 plus years, or maybe a lifetime.
I can't imagine. I mean, it'd be like buying a car without taking it for a test drive. Why would you do that?
I don't know. I think a lot of women want the mystique of kind of like, and like you said, it's a lot of cultural misconceptions or misnomers, but I definitely wanted to live with my husband at least 6 months before we got married because I wanted to see what his habits were. Can I live with this guy? That's, I think, really important.
I think it is. I think that what people maybe want to avoid is the tendency to think, our relationship, people who are living together, our relationship isn't going very well. Perhaps if we get married, it'll fix this problem. And I think that there are people who do that, but we're smarter than that, right?
Yeah, that sounds kind of like our marriage isn't going well. Let's have a couple kids.
And people, believe it or not, do make these decisions. While we're advocating for things, can I just advocate for prenuptial agreements?
Okay, sure.
As an economist, I think of marriage as a contract. By the way, I don't know if you actually got to the part of my book where I have my economic marriage vows. They're coldly cynical, but I like them. It's interesting that we all know that marriage is a contract. I think that we know in our hearts that there's the dress and the party and the flowers and the photographer, but really what you're doing is you're signing a contract. That should be clear to people, since you do at some point in this service sign the contract, right?
It's a legal contract, and in some states you can get really screwed over, pardon my French, if you're, like in a communal, what is it called, where person gets 50-50 and you're the woman in America who is making more money and has higher education, which is highly likely with the statistics.
Yes. When I was in France, I met several women they were American women. They had good educations. They were earning good money, and they married French, I'm doing air quotes here, but you can't see it, artists. They married really hot French men who did nothing. And then they ended up getting divorced from them and ended up paying like spousal support for the remainder of their lives because they were earning so much and their partner was earning nothing. And you got to be really careful when you make these decisions. But the thing, so it is a contract, and I think that it's healthy to think about it as a contract and actually write a contract before you get married, because the state thinks you've talked about these things, right? Society thinks you've talked about these things, and if you don't actually talk about them, you're really heading yourself down a very dangerous path. It's best to know in advance, the way that you think your marriage is going to play out, You just need to set out parameters and set up ways of dealing with situations. One of the things, actually, we go back and talk for a second again about developing countries, is that a lot of developing countries where you're paying, especially in Africa, where people pay a bride price, it's like the opposite of a dowry. So a man gets married,
so a dowry is, for those of you who don't know, is when the groom offers money, gifts, farm animals, houses, land, or whatever for the woman, right? And
no,
you're saying
the
it's the opposite of
dowry
this.
is when the woman's family gives the man's family money. That's what you have predominantly in India.
Oh, so I had it
And
switched.
then a bride price is when the man pays the woman's family. And what's interesting is that there's some African countries where the bride price is actually refundable if the woman cheats, right?
Okay.
So if you get married and you give the family 2 goats, and your wife has a sexual relationship with somebody else, the husband can go back and demand his goats back, right? It's a really interesting arrangement. And you asked me before what surprises me. This is one of the things that interests me, is that when they have these arrangements, women are far less likely to cheat in their marriages because their families will be punished financially. But men are actually more likely to cheat.
And why is that? Because they have this they don't have to pay.
They don't have to pay.
Right? They can get it.
And I think that in many relationships we have what we might call a tit for tat relationship, where if you cheat, I'm going to cheat too, right? And so you have a way of saying, in advance, if you don't want me to cheat, the best thing you should do is not cheat, right? And then in these bride price arrangements, it's impossible for the woman to retaliate with cheating if her husband cheats. And so this frees men up to have higher levels of infidelity.
Because the woman doesn't want to bring shame on her family by having to return the bride price.
So she's the only one who's punished in the arrangement. Well, okay, so let's go back to prenuptial agreements. A lot of couples write prenuptial agreements that talk about infidelity, and they particularly talk about infidelity by women in cases where the men have a lot of money. So, for example, you might write in a prenuptial agreement that she gets half of his estate, but if she cheats in the marriage, she gets no money, right? And that would make sense when the man has lots of income. But if you're a woman and you're thinking about entering into one of these arrangements, you should know that increases the chance of your husband cheating. And that should be that should be somehow in the contract. Now, it's much harder for women, especially if they're not working and they have lower incomes, to find ways of writing a contract that prevents his infidelity, but they should at least think about it.
So what are so that is an important thing to put into the prenuptial agreement. What are some other tips you would have for women? Because I think a lot of times when we think about marriage, you talked about the dress, you talked about the ceremony and the cake and everything. And I think a lot of times women, we romanticize it a little bit more. Maybe that's a stereotype, I don't know. And so you're saying to look at it as what it is and protect yourself just in case.
Actually, men are far more hopelessly romantic than women are.
When it comes to marriage contracts?
In terms of marriage contracts, but men are far more likely to believe in love at first sight, and men are far more likely to believe in soulmates than women are. So the evidence seems to suggest that women are actually a little bit more grounded in relationships than men are. But lots of things. For example, I was living with my ex-husband before we got married. I really wanted to have children. He was dragging his heels on that. We talked about it, and he said, well, if we're going to have children, we should get married. And so that's why we got married, right? And then we got married, and I'm like, great, impregnate me. And he said, oh, I don't mean now. I mean at some time in the future. And so there's a lot of conflict around that. And then I had my daughter, and as soon as she was born, he said no more children. Now, that was something that we should have had in a contract. I think that sounds, crazy. You would have that in a contract, but I actually think that talking about things and writing them down, I think is very, very useful for people in advance of relationships. Where you're going to live, if somebody gets a new job, are you going to be forced to follow them to their job, or how is that going to work exactly? A lot of big decisions get made. And
that people don't talk about in
Well,
advance
you don't
before
talk
they get
about them in
married.
advance. And one of the things too that is that a lot of the way that bargaining power is distributed in marriages. So we talk about bargaining power. You can actually just define it this way: is that if you have two people and they have a conflict over anything, whether or not it's going to be whether or not you're going to have another child or where you're going to go on your holiday next year, your bargaining power is the probability that you're going to win any one particular disagreement. And bargaining power is very closely tied to income. And so what I think that many women don't realize when they get married is that if you get married and you have a couple of children, you decide as a couple that you're going to reduce your work time to part-time, or you're going to opt out of the workforce altogether. Women don't necessarily realize how much that's going to erode away their bargaining power. Their decisions to make very simple things like where you're going to live. A woman who's a stay-at-home mom, when her husband gets a job in another city, it's very difficult for her to say no to that.
Is it just a feeling of entitlement with the working spouse?
Well,
Or
I
is
think
it?
I mean I think it comes directly from what people's outside options are, right? A woman who's working and his ability to support herself and ability to support her children has more outside options. She has a threat point, right? I'm not saying that every day you're going to have. He's going to say, "Let's go to Cabo for Christmas," and she's going to say, "Screw you, I can support myself." But it's there implicitly in the relationship, right? And money
Money
is
is
power.
power.
It's true in relationships as well. And I think that it's really, really good to have these conversations. Not even just before you get married, but at every step of the way. If a woman's going to opt out of the workforce, or if men will opt out of the workforce as well to take care of children, and it goes both ways. You need to have conversations about what the arrangements are going to be, so that you don't find yourself in a position where things are happening in your life that you do not like, because that just leads to general unhappiness for everybody, and it's not going to help relationships last in the long run.
And well, we're talking about money and marriage, and let's talk about finance in marriage, because supposedly, I don't know, because you've corrected some of my statistics, and I'm glad you have, because they're misconceptions. If I'm saying something that is a misconception, I want you to correct me. And I have heard that money and finance is the number one reason for divorce, and so people need to talk about this. And I know when I got married, my husband was very sheepish to talk about finances in the beginning. I said, all right, we probably should have had the conversation before, but now we're on the same page. But I said, hey, let's talk about our financial situation, how we're going to save money, how we're going to invest, how we're going to run the household. And in his family growing up, they just didn't talk about that stuff. And it was like a shocker to him. My family, we didn't talk about it either, which is why I wanted to talk about it, because my parents had endless arguments over finances and money. And it's a very important
Don't you
topic.
find that even when you're dating that you need to talk about money? I find I find this really interesting. Back in the day, you wouldn't necessarily have conversations, but I know that I'm seeing somebody now, and we constantly have conversations about money, because we don't just go through our whole relationship assuming that he's going to pay for things, right? So we're kind of in a state of the world where even before you're married, people have to have conversations about money. I have a friend who's recently been having some conflict with his girlfriend, because they agreed to split the price of a trip, but then when they went on the trip, he paid for everything, so he wasn't very happy about that. So we all need to have conversations about money, and we all need to have a healthier attitude in talking about money. We're worse at talking about money than we are talking about sex. Actually, as a society, we're quite happy to sit around and talk about sex, but God forbid we should talk about money. So I think that this is true. And you didn't have the conversation before you got married, but that's fine, because I think that you constantly have to have these conversations over and over and over again as you move through your life, because circumstances change. I mean, one of these days you two will be deciding, making things about whether or not you're going to retire and who's going to pay the bills, and all of these money conversations. They have to continue, and I think that you're right. I mean, is it the number one reason for divorces? I mean, it's really hard to pin that down. It's not infidelity, which I know that everybody thinks it is, but it's not.
Supposedly it's finance. Infidelity is like third or something. I forgot what second
when
was.
I was writing the book, I have a whole chapter on infidelity. And so I searched very, very hard for some concrete evidence that there's any relationship between infidelity and divorce. And I could find absolutely none. None. There is no evidence that infidelity causes divorce. There is plenty of evidence that unhappy marriages cause infidelity.
That's
so,
true.
You might want to say that your marriage ended because she cheated or because he cheated, but it's and that might
sometimes that's more of a result, like a symptom than an actual
than
cause.
Anything else. Yeah. So another thing, that people like to say is the internet. If you actually Google, I love the Google Complete, where you start typing something and Google finishes the question for you. And so if you start typing in why people get divorced, the internet comes up all the time, right? The internet's to blame. Ashley Madison, the guy who runs that website, is personally responsible for divorce.
So for those of you who don't know, Ashley Madison is a website where you can find people who are looking to cheat.
We call that on the job search. But yeah, it's interesting because the internet is not responsible for marriages ending. As much as we want to blame that, it's not. I mean, infidelity is in decline. It's not in increasing since the internet came along. Divorce rates have been in decline ever since. In fact, divorce rates in the U.S. have been falling every year that you've had access to online dating. So there's just no reason to believe that the internet is causing people to cheat and that's causing marriages to fail. It's much more likely that financial stress and conflict over how often people should have sex. Those are the type of things that causes marriages to break down.
And if anything, I would say maybe it isn't finance as number one, but maybe communication over finance. Because like you said in the example you just gave, this couple went on vacation together. They were supposed to split the cost and he ended up paying for everything. So maybe he was more upset that something was agreed upon and then broken than actually having to pay for it.
In some respects, he has himself to blame because he didn't say anything. You didn't want to ruin their holiday and by saying, excuse me, you're supposed to be helping pay for some of these meals, right? And so you're right. I think that their communication is an issue.
I think communication about finances might be more of an issue than actual communications. But I think it is very important to talk about. And we've had, me and my husband have had several re-talks, because we've been trying to decide whether to move or what to do. And so we kind of discuss it. But I just still think there's a taboo. I mean, there's still a taboo about talking about finance. There's a taboo about talking about how much you get paid. And I personally don't like it. I think, you can, first of all, I don't understand the taboo of talking about how much you get paid because anyone can Google or go on Indeed.com or, Glassdoor.com and figure out a salary range. But I do feel that there is a negative energy or stigma when I've been at, dinner parties or talking with people and the conversation of pay range or those things come up and maybe it has to do with people being embarrassed that they're not getting paid as much as they should, or I'm not sure where that comes from, but I've felt it and seen it firsthand.
Too, right? If you go to China, you meet people and they say, "How nice to meet you. What did you have for lunch?" Which is a strange question. And how much do you get paid? While they're shaking your hand. And so it's an interesting kind of Western approach to not, is considered quite rude to ask people how much they're paid. Here in Canada, and I think this is true for many U.S. states, if you work for in a government position, which includes professors at the university, everybody has their salaries online. So we can just Google, actually find out specifically what my colleagues are being paid. It's free information that's available on the internet. And yet I could never ask them what they would be being paid. They would be horrified, and they certainly wouldn't tell me, even though it's freely available information. So it's true that we don't like to talk about it.
But I think it kind of, like you're talking about, different bargaining chips and different power plays in negotiation. I mean, I think that puts the worker at a disadvantage, and the corporation, in our case, at an advantage because they're, a lot of job applications these days, they don't have a salary range. You put in what you think you deserve, and I don't really like that.
And I think it's actually particularly hard on women.
Because women tend to, I think women tend to ask for less or certain. I mean, again, I don't know if my statistics are correct. I've read that in places. And I don't like it. I think it gives, more power. And the only reason I can assume that is because of the disparity in pay that still exists among women and men.
It's one of the things that's driving the disparity as well. I think that women are not taught to promote themselves. And so you apply for a job, you don't want to say, you should pay me $120,000 a year, because it kind of goes against our nature, whereas men are more willing to do that. And so it's one of the things that actually drives this wage inequality they have, because women are just more reluctant to ask for it. But what's even more horrifying is that women who do ask for it are actually punished, right? If you're afraid for negotiating and you're a woman, you have good reason to be afraid, because the evidence suggests that you do not fare well in a negotiation, not the same way that men do. But, I just thought of something else. If people talk about going on blind dates and they walk into the restaurant and they see somebody and they're like, oh my gosh, how can I get out of this? One way to do that would just be to simply sit down and say, so how much do you earn? That's a great strategy, right? To get out of a date that you don't want to be on.
It is a great strategy. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but before we do, I just have one more question. You are Canadian and you're in Canada, and I want to ask you, why in the heck does your Canadian book cover look way more sexy than the American book cover? Come on!
It was really, really interesting dealing with two different publishers. I'm not saying anything against my American publisher. They were much more puritanical about what the book was going to be about than my Canadian. The Canadians are like, yeah, sex work, bring it on. But the publisher is like, I don't know, maybe we should exclude all the sex, because originally it was going to have a whole sex work chapter. And it was really interesting dealing with the two different perspectives. I don't think Canadians are as scared off by the ideas of talking about sex. I mean, we have our own hang-ups, right? It was the Canadian publisher actually produced the cover first, and we were all really excited about it. And we sent it to the American publisher and went, "Look at this awesome cover." And the Americans went, "No, no, we're not doing that."
I love the Canadian cover. It has a very sexy lady straddling a statistic.
Actually, that was the pinup girl was my idea. I was traveling around in Europe, and we were in Milan. And I was looking at a book of pictures of pinup girls, and I thought, I really want to have a pinup girl on the cover of my book. I just love how empowered the pinup girls are, right? Their sexy clothes. And so I proposed that to them, and they were like, great, that sounds fabulous. And so that's what they did. So, yeah, I also like the Canadian cover, but, I like the American cover, too. It's clever, so...
I like the Canadian one. I was a little jealous. I was like, is she giving her Canadian, co-countrymen the better
Korean
cover?
Because there's covers all over the world. The Korean cover really surprised me, because it's like a beer bottle with money in the top with a condom pulled over the top of the bottle. It's just like, holy smokes, the Koreans went like full hog on this.
So how can the listeners find you, follow you, buy your book,
well, the best way to find me is the way that you found me, which is on Twitter, because I'm constantly there. So I'm at Dollars and Sex. And then, of course, my book is available chapters. I'm sorry, this is Canadian to me, at Barnes & Noble and Amazon. I have a Facebook group, Dollars and Sex. So if you Google Dollars and Sex, you're going to find me there. And
also her website is marinaadshade.com, correct? And that's your blog as well.
I'm actually writing for Time at the moment. So you'll also find me at time.com. That's where my new blog is at the moment. So I'm pretty excited about that, yeah.
Okay. Well, you guys find her and buy her book, Dollars and Sex, and find out all of the interesting information and more. We did not get to talk about everything, unfortunately. This has been Out of the Box Podcast with Rosie Tran. Don't forget to visit our sponsors, hugmetees.com. Spread love, give a hug, hugmetees.com. Guys, don't forget, go on iTunes, click on the subscribe button. It really helps us a lot. We've gotten so many positive comments lately, and I love all the emails, but subscribing helps us out even more because it pushes us up on the podcast recommendation list on iTunes. Subscribe on Stitcher as well. And if you would like to support the podcast, we are now accepting donations through Bitcoin. So go on our website, outoftheboxpodcast.com, and click on the support button. This has been Out of the Box Podcast with Rosie Tran.